The Bridgeport K9 Retirement Ceremony had been running for 11 years without incident. That record ended on a Tuesday morning in October, when 6 police dogs abandoned their handlers, knocked over a folding table, and threw themselves at a young woman in paint-stained overalls who had been quietly trying to disappear into the back of the crowd. Nobody had noticed her arrive. That was the point. She had slipped in through the side gate near the parking structure, keeping her head low under the brim of a faded green baseball cap, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her hands were shoved deep into the front pocket of a grey hoodie that had seen better decades. She smelled faintly of turpentine and dog, and she stood at the very edge of the civilian section, pressed against the iron railing like she was trying to decide whether to stay or run. Her name was Nadia. She was 28 years old, and she had not planned on coming at all. The Bridgeport Police Department's annual K9 Retirement and Service Ceremony was held in the wide marble courtyard outside City Hall, ringed by oak trees that had just begun to turn. It was an impressive display. The mayor was there, along with 3 city council members, 2 state legislators, and a cluster of news cameras that had been jockeying for position since 7 in the morning. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform where 6 German shepherds sat at perfect attention beside their uniformed handlers, their tactical vests gleaming under the thin October sun. These were not ordinary dogs. These were the dogs that had located a missing 6-year-old in 48 hours of dense woodland, the dog that had cornered a fugitive who had evaded law enforcement for 9 months, the dog that had sniffed out a pressure cooker device packed into a duffel bag under bleachers at a high school football game, saving hundreds of lives on a Friday night in November. Chief Sandra Okafor-Webb stood at the podium in her dress uniform, her posture immaculate, her voice carrying without effort across the courtyard. She spoke about sacrifice and service, about the unique language between a handler and a working dog, about what it meant to partner with an animal that would throw itself into danger on a single spoken word. The crowd listened with the particular reverence Americans reserve for things they know they do not fully understand. 6 rows from the front, Sergeant Felix Drummond stood beside his dog, a 6-year-old German shepherd named Reckless, who was staring forward with the focused, expressionless intensity of an animal that had been trained to notice everything. Drummond had worked with Reckless for 4 years. He knew the dog's breathing patterns in his sleep. He knew when Reckless was alert versus anxious versus tracking. He knew what it sounded like when Reckless found something. He did not know what it sounded like when Reckless remembered someone. At the far edge of the civilian section, near the iron railing, a young woman in paint-stained overalls shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The wind changed direction. Reckless moved first. It was not a dramatic movement. He simply stopped staring forward and turned his head to the left, ears rotating like satellite dishes, black nose lifting into the air. Then his whole body followed, slowly, deliberately, the way a compass needle finds north. Drummond felt the leash tighten. Rec, forward. He kept his voice low, sharp. Reckless did not comply. He took 1 step to the left. Then another. A low sound rose from his throat. Not a growl, not a bark, but something between the two that Drummond had genuinely never heard from the dog in 4 years of partnership. It sounded almost like a question. Reckless. Drummond put more authority into it this time. The dog took 3 rapid steps sideways and then lunged, and the leash went from slack to taut too. Nothing, the clip snapped. 102 pounds of tactical German shepherd was suddenly moving at full speed through a formal ceremony in front of the mayor of Bridgeport. What followed was 17 seconds of absolute chaos. Sergeant Drummond screamed "Loose dog" into his radio as he sprinted after Reckless. Officers near the perimeter grabbed for their batons. Chief Okafor-Webb's voice cut out mid-sentence. One of the council members tipped backward off his folding chair. People scattered. Camera operators swung their lenses to follow the dog. A rookie patrol woman named Garza planted herself directly in Reckless's path, with both arms out. Prepared to intercept a potential attack on civilians, Reckless blew past her without even glancing in her direction. The other 5 dogs broke within seconds of each other. Bravo went first, ripping his leash out of Officer Peña's grip. Then Sentinel, then Cobalt, then Storm, then Jax, all of them abandoning the precision formation that had taken months of training to perfect, all of them streaming toward the same point at the far edge of the courtyard, leaving their handlers behind them with empty leashes and expressions of raw disbelief. Officer Garza spun around, raised her baton. She stopped. The 6 dogs had reached the iron railing. They had reached the young woman in the paint-stained overalls, and they were not attacking. Reckless had his front paws on her shoulders and was making a sound that Sergeant Drummond, who had by now caught up and was standing 10 feet away with his chest heaving, would later describe as the closest thing to crying I've ever heard from an animal. Bravo had his massive head buried in the crook of her left arm. Sentinel and Storm were pressed against her legs from either side, trembling. Cobalt was spinning in tight circles behind her, whimpering. Jax had simply sat down directly on her feet, looked up at her, and refused to move. The woman had dropped to her knees. She was shaking. Her baseball cap had fallen off somewhere in the chaos. Her face was buried in Reckless's thick fur, and her shoulders were moving in a way that made it clear she was sobbing. "I know," she kept saying, over and over, barely audible over the frantic whimpering of the dogs. "I know. I'm here. I'm right here." The courtyard had gone completely silent. Sergeant Drummond stared at his dog. Reckless, who had never once allowed a civilian to touch him without Drummond's express command. Reckless, who had bitten through a thick leather sleeve on his first day at the precinct and sent a trainer to the ER. Reckless, who still required a specific verbal clearance before the precinct veterinarian could examine him. That Reckless was now draped across a stranger's lap, making the sound of a lost puppy finally finding its way home. Chief Okafor-Webb came down from the podium. She moved through the stunned crowd, through the ring of officers, who had formed a loose perimeter around the woman and the dogs, and she stopped at the edge of the circle. She looked at the young woman for a long moment. "Who are you?" she asked, not unkindly, with genuine bewilderment. The young woman looked up. Her eyes were red. There was a streak of what might have been dried blue paint across her left cheek, or it might have been tears mixing with something that had been there before she arrived. She took a breath. "My name is Nadia Osei," she said. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause a scene. I needed to see them." She put both hands on Reckless's face, holding it the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable. "I raised them," she said quietly. "All 6 of them. They were mine before they were yours." Chief Okafor-Webb looked at Sergeant Drummond. Drummond looked at Reckless, who had not moved from Nadia's lap, and showed no signs of doing so. The ceremony was suspended. The cameras were asked to stop rolling. The crowd was ushered out by patrolmen who had no good explanation to offer, and Nadia Osei, 28 years old, paint on her hands and tears on her face, was escorted into the building with 6 German shepherds walking calmly at her sides, ignoring every handler who tried to redirect them. The conference room on the 4th floor of Bridgeport City Hall was not designed for 6 large dogs. The facilities operations manager made that clear 3 times before Chief Okafor-Webb asked him, without raising her voice, to please find somewhere else to be. Nadia sat at the long conference table. Reckless had settled under her chair with his head on her feet, which made it physically difficult for her to stand if she wanted to, which she did not. Bravo and Sentinel were on either side of her, close enough that their fur pressed against her legs. The other 3 had distributed themselves around the room in a loose protective perimeter, watching the door. Sergeant Drummond sat across from her. Chief Okafor-Webb sat at the head of the table. Deputy Chief Harlan Vogel, who had been pulled from a budget meeting and still had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, sat beside the chief with a legal pad he had not yet written anything on. "Start from the beginning," Chief Okafor-Webb said. Nadia's hands were around a paper cup of coffee that someone had brought her. She had not drunk any of it. "I grew up on my grandmother's property outside Millhaven," she said. "Eastern Connecticut. She had land, about 40 acres, mostly fields and second-growth forest. After she died, she left it to me. I was 22. I had just dropped out of the veterinary program at UConn after my second year. I didn't have money. I didn't have a plan. What I had was 40 acres and a skill for working with dogs." She paused. "I started small. I knew there were working dog rescue organizations, but most of them focused on easy placements. Labs, retrievers, dogs that had been pets first. Nobody wanted to deal with the shepherd mixes, the high-drive dogs, the ones that had been used for illegal guard work and then abandoned when they got too unpredictable. I started taking those, the ones other rescues turned down." Deputy Chief Vogel wrote something on his legal pad for the first time. He underlined it. "Within 2 years, I had a real facility," Nadia continued. "I built the kennel runs myself mostly. I took in donations. I worked with a retired trainer named Beaumont Pruitt. He's the one who taught me formal obedience methodology. I learned how to read a traumatized dog and figure out if what looked like aggression was actually fear. I learned how to give them a job without breaking what was left of them." She looked down at Reckless. "He was the first one I ever brought back from a genuine, no-hope situation," she said. "His registered name was Reckless. I kept it because he'd answered to it. But when I found him, he was 18 months old and living in a crate in a condemned auto shop in Waterbury. 37 pounds, German Shepherd. Full-drive animal, completely feral from isolation. The ACO who pulled him said he'd bitten 3 people, and there was no path forward. They gave me 12 hours before the euthanasia appointment." Sergeant Drummond had very quietly put down his pen. "I drove out there at 10 o'clock at night," Nadia said. "I sat outside his crate for 4 hours without moving or speaking. Just let him get my scent. That's it. That was the whole plan. By 2 in the morning, he was pressed against the crate door trying to get closer to me." She pulled back her left sleeve. Along the inside of her forearm, from wrist to elbow, was a long, pale scar. "Week 3, she said. "My fault. I moved too fast. He got scared and he reacted. I didn't hold it against him." She pulled the sleeve down. "He never bit me again." Chief Okafor-Webb had been watching Reckless during this entire account. The dog had not moved. His eyes were tracking Nadia's hands, her voice, her breathing, the way an animal tracks something that belongs to it. "Tell me about the others," the chief said. Nadia set down the coffee cup. "Bravo came from a dog-fighting ring broken up in New Haven. He was being used as a bait dog. Too gentle to fight, but big enough to be useful as a target. His right ear is partially missing. You've probably noticed. The official vet report from your intake said it was a training accident during bite work practice." She glanced at Drummond. "It wasn't. That's where someone held him down." Drummond did not say anything. He had noticed the ear on day 1 and asked the department's procurement coordinator about it. He had been told the same thing Nadia just described as a lie. "Sentinel was a personal protection dog whose owner went to prison," Nadia said. "He'd been kept on a 4-foot chain for 2 years before I got him. Cobalt was surrendered to a rural shelter when his elderly owner died. No one in the family wanted a 90-pound working dog, so they signed him over, and he sat in a concrete run for 8 months until the shelter called me. Storm was found in a highway median in the middle of January. Nobody ever claimed him. Jax." She stopped. She looked at the small brown dog who was still sitting on her feet. "Jax was a puppy someone threw out of a moving car on Route 44, she said. "He was 4 months old. The woman who found him said he didn't make any sound when she picked him up, just looked at her. By the time I got him, he'd been at the shelter for 3 weeks and hadn't eaten in 4 days. They thought there was something neurologically wrong with him." She paused. "There wasn't. He was just waiting. The conference room was very quiet. You rehabilitated all 6 of these dogs, Chief Okafor-Webb said. And then what happened? Nadia's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it changed the entire quality of her expression. Then a man named Trent Harlow happened, she said. Deputy Chief Vogel's pen stopped moving. Trent Harlow's name was not unfamiliar in that building. He had served as Bridgeport's Director of Public Safety Contracts from 2019 until his sudden resignation 14 months ago, citing a desire to pursue private consulting work. He had overseen the department's K9 procurement division for 3 of those years. He had been the man responsible for sourcing, vetting, and acquiring the current K9 unit, a unit that had arrived with impeccable European certification, military pedigree documentation, and a procurement invoice totaling $412,000. Chief Okafor-Webb leaned forward. "Go on," she said. "He came to my property in March of 2022, Nadia said. He drove a county vehicle. He had 2 men with him and a folder of paperwork that he spread across my kitchen table like he owned it. He said my facility was operating in violation of a state ordinance regarding commercial kennel licensing. He said I had 48 hours to surrender all animals on site to county custody pending a compliance review." "Did you have legal representation?" "I had a phone call with a legal aid attorney who told me the ordinance he cited was real and that a compliance hold was a legitimate county action and that fighting it without documentation proving my licensing was current would take weeks, possibly months." Nadia's voice did not waver, but something behind her eyes did. "My records showed my license was current, but Harlow had a counter-document that showed a lapse in renewal. I don't know if he fabricated it, or if there was a genuine clerical error. Either way, I was 26 years old and alone, and there were 2 large men standing in my kitchen, and Harlow told me the animals would be housed at a county facility pending review and returned to me once the matter was resolved." She picked up the coffee cup again. "Put it back down without drinking. He had them loaded into transport vans within 2 hours. All 6, plus 3 other dogs I'd been fostering for a private rescue." She looked at the chief. "I stood in my driveway and watched them go. Reckless wouldn't take his eyes off me the whole time they were loading him. The van doors closed. That was the last time I saw any of them, until today." The air in the conference room felt different than it had when they sat down. Drummond noticed it. Vogel noticed it. Chief Okafor-Webb did not move for a long moment. "The compliance review," the chief said carefully. "Was it ever resolved?" "There was no review," Nadia said flatly. "I spent 6 months trying to reach the County Animal Services office and was told every time that my case was under administrative processing. I hired an attorney. He sent 3 letters. He received 1 response, which stated that the animals in question had been transferred to certified placement partners and were no longer in county custody. When I asked who the placement partners were, I was told that information was confidential under state animal welfare protocols." She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a folded envelope. She placed it on the table. The paper was worn at the folds, softened from handling. "I found them 7 weeks ago," she said. "Not because I had a private investigator or legal resources. Because I was watching a Bridgeport news segment about the K9 unit on my phone at 2 in the morning, the way I do every few months hoping. And they showed a training clip. Reckless was tracking a scent trail, and the way he turns, he drops his left shoulder before he commits to a direction. He's done that since he was 2 years old. It's just how he moves." She looked up. "No other dog moves like that. I knew it was him in about 4 seconds. She slid the envelope across the table. "That's my original intake documentation for all 6 dogs. Dated, photographed with vet records from Dr. Corinne Bakshi in Millhaven, who treated all of them from the time I brought them in. The surgical notes for Bravo's ear are in there. The nutritional logs for Reckless's first 8 weeks. Jax's first clean bill of health." Chief Okafor-Webb did not open the envelope. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Sergeant Drummond. Drummond was looking at his dog, his partner of 4 years, the animal he had run into a burning warehouse with on a Wednesday night last February, the animal he had sat with in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner at 3 in the morning after a particularly bad call, not talking, just existing next to each other in the quiet. "Is it possible," Drummond said slowly, "that the procurement documentation is fraudulent?" Chief Okafor-Webb opened the envelope. She read for 4 minutes. No one spoke. Reckless made a small sound in his sleep under Nadia's chair. "Get me Trent Harlow's full procurement file," the chief said to Vogel without looking up, "and get the city attorney on the phone." What followed was not swift, but it was thorough. The city attorney arrived within 40 minutes. A forensic accountant was contacted by end of day. The procurement records for the K9 unit, the European import documentation, the certification paperwork from a Munich-based breeder called Steinwald Tactical Kennels, the expense authorizations signed by Trent Harlow, were pulled and reviewed by people who knew what fabricated bureaucratic documentation looked like. It looked like this. The microchips in all 6 dogs were real. The chip numbers were registered to legitimate European breeding records. What the investigation would eventually uncover over the following 8 weeks was that Harlow had purchased the chip registration data from a broker operating in the grey market of working dog certification, a practice that was not uncommon among people who needed to give shelter dogs the provenance of purpose-bred animals. The European papers were real. The dogs behind them were not. Harlow had seized 6 dogs from a legitimate rescue operation, sold their identities to a documentation broker, and billed the Bridgeport Police Department $412,000 for animals he had acquired at 0 cost. He had pocketed the difference. When Vogel brought this summary to Chief Okafor-Webb, she sat with it for a long time. She had a department that had built its K9 program on fraudulent procurement. She had a city that had publicly celebrated these dogs for 3 years. She had defense attorneys who were going to have a field day with certification questions in pending cases. And she had a 28-year-old woman in a conference room 4 floors up, whose animals had been stolen by a man who was currently living in a 3-bedroom condo in Scottsdale, Arizona. She went back upstairs. Nadia was still in the conference room. She had not asked to leave. The 6 dogs were arranged around her in an arrangement that had slowly shifted over the past several hours into something that looked less like captivity and more like a den. Drummond was still there too, sitting across from her, and they had been talking. Not about the case, about the dogs, about specific things each of them knew. Drummond had described the sound Reckless made the night of the warehouse fire, and Nadia had said yes. "He does that. He's done that since I first started him on search work. That sound means he's locked on." Drummond had looked at her for a long moment after that. Chief Okafor-Webb sat down at the head of the table again. "Trent Harlow is being referred to the state attorney's office," she said. "The charges will include fraud, embezzlement, and violations of state animal welfare statutes. I expect there will be federal involvement given the documentation forgery. I won't make promises about outcomes, but I will tell you that this office will cooperate fully with every investigation and that we will be pursuing this aggressively." Nadia nodded once. "Legally," the chief continued, "the documentation we have reviewed today, alongside the veterinary records you've provided, establishes your prior ownership of all 6 animals. If you want them back, I live in a studio apartment in Hartford," Nadia said quietly. "I work at a home renovation company. I paint walls." She looked around the table. "I don't have my grandmother's land anymore. I had to sell it the year after the seizure to cover legal fees." Nobody spoke. "I didn't come here to take them," she said. It was the same sentence, Drummond thought, the same exact shape that you could spend years practicing and still not be able to say without your voice breaking. She said it clearly. "I came because I needed to know they were okay. I needed to know what happened to them." She looked at Reckless, who had woken up at some point in the last hour and was now sitting next to her chair with his shoulder pressed against her knee. "And they're okay?" Drummond leaned forward. "Nadia." "I saw that clip of Reckless on the news," she said. "The one where he took down the armed robbery suspect outside the credit union on Main. And I cried for about an hour. Not because I was sad." She looked at Drummond, "Because when I had him, I spent 2 years trying to give him a job that fit what he was. I couldn't do it. I didn't have the resources, the infrastructure. He needed a real partner and a real mission, and I couldn't give him that." She scratched Reckless behind the ear. "You did." Chief Okaforweb had been watching this exchange. She looked at Drummond, who gave her the smallest nod she had ever seen a senior sergeant produce. "Mrs. Osei," the chief said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand it's a genuine question, not a formality." She paused. "How did you train them?" Nadia looked at her. "The dogs that your unit purchased, the official story was that they came from a military working dog program in Europe, trained under a specific Schutzhund protocol. But our handlers have noted for 3 years that these dogs respond to commands differently than any European program produces. The bonding patterns are unusual, the trauma sensitivity is unusual, the way they work through stress is unusual." The chief folded her hands on the table. "We assumed it was a quirk of their breeding. But it's not breeding, is it?" "No," Nadia said. "So how?" Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't train a traumatized dog the same way you train a dog that's never been hurt. A dog that's been hurt knows that force ends conversations, so you don't use force. You use time. You use consistency. You build a vocabulary of safe things, a specific sound, a specific touch, a routine that never changes, and you expand it. You make the world slightly bigger every week without ever going so fast that they feel like they're losing the safe part." She looked at Reckless. "You're not teaching them obedience. You're teaching them that they can trust their own judgment again. When you do that, when a dog learns that its instincts are reliable, that the world makes sense, they become better at the actual job than any dog trained purely through compliance. Because they're not working out of submission. They're working out of genuine partnership." The room was very quiet. Chief Okaforweb looked at Vogel. Vogel looked at his legal pad. "The department has been trying for 3 years to replicate whatever behavioral framework these dogs came with," the chief said. "Every trainer we've brought in has told us they've never seen animals that work like this, and now you're telling me it's not a methodology, it's a person." Nadia started to say something and stopped. "We have," the chief continued, "a recently approved budget line for a civilian canine behavior and welfare consultant. The position has been open for 14 months because we cannot find someone qualified. The role involves working with the unit 3 days per week, advising on behavioral training and welfare protocols, and supporting handlers in reading and responding to their dogs." Nadia looked at her. "It also comes with a full review of the Harlow procurement, a formal acknowledgement of the theft of your animals by this department, and a compensation package we would work out with the city attorney for the documented loss of your property and your facility." "I don't have a degree," Nadia said. "I didn't finish the veterinary program." "I'm aware," said Chief Okaforweb. "You also turned a dog that bit through a bite sleeve and sent a trainer to the ER into the finest tracking animal in this department's history, using 4 hours of sitting quietly in the dark." The chief looked at her steadily. "I'm not hiring your degree. I'm hiring that." Nadia looked at Reckless. Reckless looked at Nadia. Under the table, his tail moved once, twice in a slow, certain rhythm. She had lost her grandmother's land. She had lost the kennels she built with her own hands, the pastures, the facility, the years. She had lost the version of herself that had believed, with the specific confidence of someone who does not yet know how many ways things can go wrong, that she was doing something permanent. She had not lost the thing she had actually built. "Okay," she said. "Yes. 6 weeks later, Trent Harlow was arrested at Scottsdale Phoenix International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Lisbon. He was extradited to Connecticut and charged with 15 counts spanning fraud, embezzlement, and animal cruelty statutes, the latter enhanced by the documented seizure of animals from a licensed rescue operation under false pretense. His trial date was set for the following spring. Meanwhile, on a Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday each week, a woman in paint-stained work pants and a department-issued lanyard that she always forgot to tuck in would walk through the side entrance of the Bridgeport K9 facility carrying 2 travel mugs of coffee, one for her, one for Sergeant Drummond, who had started arriving early on her days to ask questions he kept a notebook of. She would move through the kennels in the way she always had, unhurried, low to the ground, speaking to each dog the way you speak to someone who already knows you. And every single time, before she reached the kennel door, she could already hear them. 6 dogs who knew her footsteps. 6 dogs who had not forgotten. They were waiting for her, the way they had always been waiting, in the patient and absolute way of animals who understand, without words, that some people are worth waiting for.